Hi everyone. Good to see you on my channel today. Today I will tell you a wonderful story. It is full of love and kindness. I hope you enjoy it and I wish you an enjoyable viewing experience. Thank you. Izzy, your broadcasts have been weak lately. Your views are dropping. Your audience is passive. You don't have the fire we're used to. We have to do something. Bob, the producer, is continuously running in circles in the small studio and waving his arms around. We have to do something. That's what we're doing. Izzy sits at his laptop and looks thoughtfully at his troubled colleague. It's not a decision. We have a general meeting at the end of the month where the head boss will be too. I'm already setting myself up to get the loudest reprimand possible. And it's all because of you, Elsie. You hear me? Bob's raising his voice. Creativity is a thing that can't be awakened by threats of reprimands. Izzy remains calm. What the hell is creativity, Izzy? Your job is just to find interesting, bright, unique people and bring them to our studio. It's purely technical. It doesn't require any special knowledge, experience, strength. You lowered the bar to our heroes, and this is the result. Bob is relentless in his outrage. Look, a year ago we had Emily, the most epic singer, with almost 10 million views, and that's not the limit. Here's a little-known rapper, Tootie, who dared to tell on camera about his first kiss with a girl of easy behavior. Also went down well with the public. And now what? Bob jabbed at the checklist from tonight's broadcast and boiled over again. My God! We have Her Majesty's absolutely boring architect as our guest tonight. I know these fellows. They're no less boring than lawyers or scientists. Their pedantry and perfectionism infects others through the air, and that doesn't ignite our audience. It doesn't. People watch us when they are tired of their own pedantry and perfectionism. You need some pepper. You need some fire, Izzy. I wouldn't have missed your guest tonight at all if I'd known a little sooner. Bob sat down at his desk and covered his face with his hands. I think our audience will like her. There's something elusive about her that instantly binds a person to her. You'll see, you'll like her too. We'll add a little impromptu flair. I've prepared a couple of provocative questions, but the guest doesn't know about them, said Izzy. That, Izzy, is called a no-win. No. Fail situation for today. So I'm not going to torture myself with this topic any further. I hope you find someone more interesting for the next episode period, said Bob. There were a few minutes left before the live broadcast started. The assistant informed Izzy that the guest had arrived at the studio and was ready for the broadcast. Izzy greeted her guests just before the start of the broadcast. Good evening, our dear viewers. Today I have a slightly atypical guest on my channel. You may not know her, but the products of her creativity surround you everywhere. My guest has developed a project for the renovation of our city, which has been successfully realized for the 5th year. Thanks to her creative solutions, now you and I live, work, and walk, not surrounded by standard gray buildings, but in the atmosphere of a distinctive city with a unique culture. All tourists are delighted with the new look of our city. You know it yourself. Take a photo in any place of our city and the picture will be like a studio shot. This is all thanks to the unique design solutions of our heroine. Now our whole city is a magical island of unique decoration. And so, meet Leah Collin, our city's chief designer. Leah Collin turned out to be a modest, friendly, and rather quiet girl. You could tell she was a little nervous. Hello, Izzy. I am very pleased with your attention. Thank you for inviting me to your studio. Leah, please tell us your success story. How did you manage to build such a dizzying career? As far as we know, participating in the transformation of our city is your first major project. How did you get involved? I'd love to tell some very fascinating story on this subject, but there isn't one, smiled Leah. In fact, everything happened as if it was meant to be. I've had to work quite hard, but it's not in the journey of advancing as a designer. It's in finding that path. It was quite a long one. But once I found it and realized that this was my purpose, things started to fall into place on their own. Izzy was getting worried because she was hoping to hear a really dramatic story about determination, obstacles to success, competitors' intrigues, personal insight, the ability to find irregularities, mysterious patrons, and so on. You need that to keep the audience's attention. And what, while this girl carries to the masses, Bob can generally reject as uninteresting material and not put on the channel. And how do you manage to get such unique results every time, using a standard set of solutions? Residents of our city remember that before you, there were also many architects and designers offering similar solutions, but their variants were not approved. I think there's some mystery here too, don't you think? He asked, expecting to get a more expressive answer. To be honest, I don't know much about the proposals of my predecessors. Why did you accept my offer? I think you should ask the people who made that decision. Izzy seemed to be slowly losing her temper. She really made a mistake in choosing the heroine for the show. Such unremarkable answers shouldn't even be on TV. They can't keep the viewer's attention for a minute. So you mean to say that you directly, so easily and effortlessly ascended to the pedestal of your career? Are you saying that getting a leading role in the country's top project is something that happens all by itself? Izzy was still hoping to hear something different. Leah Cullen was now really starting to get nervous and anxious. She clearly wasn't prepared for such an assertive interview. If she had known that she would have to undergo such an emotional strain, she would have definitely refused to do it. Leah decided it wasn't too late to take it all back. She thought for a moment, took the tiny microphone off her shirt collar and placed it on the table. I'm sorry. I'm not ready for this format of public speaking. I don't have to make excuses for my accomplishments, Leah Collins said, and wiped away a tear with the tip of her index finger. She was about to leave the studio. Stop camera, shouted Izzy. Leah, I think you're overexcited. It's okay, go on. If possible, try to tell some poignant moments, some emotional stories. It'll boost your ratings too, said host Izzy. The show was boring and unremarkable. Izzy was preparing for a showdown with her producer. The only thing at the end of the airing, the guest asked if she could make personal appeals. Asia didn't expect to get any extravaganza yet, so she didn't care how to end the episode. She allowed her guest to make a personal address, period. I would like to take this opportunity to thank some important people in my life. His name is Arthur, her name is Wendy. They and I are not really that close, and never could be. However, these people have played a huge role in my formation. I just want to thank them for being in my life, said Leah. Stop camera. These must be your mentors or teachers, Izzy asked idly, gathering her papers on the table. No. These are my stepfather and his spouse. They raised me in a specific spirit. It was they who served a huge role in the unexpected turn of my fate. If it weren't for these people, there's no telling where I'd be, Leah said. Woo. Can you elaborate on that? I think it will be interesting for the audience point. I don't know how much the audience will be able to accept this story. It would be very difficult for me to talk about it, but years later, when I see my life as a single road, I see these people as important turning points in my life. Izzy briefly put the story down on paper and ran to producer Bob. Bob gave it some thought and said, "Is this going to cause any scandal in any way? If so, that's great. We can regain our ratings again. And if not, then we stay in our failed quagmire and have nothing to lose. Run it, we'll see," Bob said idly. Izzy returned to the studio and now seriously tried to convince her guest to tell the story. It wasn't easy, but eventually the guest agreed. It is much easier for people to endure all the trials along the way, to achieve their goals and desires, than to tell the general public about them. It seems to the masses from the outside that the way to the top is through some kind of springboard in the form of an influential family, a patron, a lot of money, or a lucky coincidence. But is it? The microphone was placed back on Leah's collar. The cameras turned on. The spotlights came on and Leah began her story. If I may, I will tell my story not in chronological order, starting with the most significant events, said Leah quietly. Yes, please. We are listening to you carefully. Azy tried to be as polite as possible so as not to traumatize her guest with her assertiveness. The smell of a damp dugout has a huge significance in my life. I had to spend part of my life in a completely enclosed, damp dugout basement. That day or night, you don't know what time of day it is when you're constantly sitting in a confined, dark space. I had unlimited power in that cellar. I could lie in any corner of it. I could stand in it, or I could sit and aimlessly go through the little bits of cloth and paper I managed to hide under my dress when I found myself among people. For the first few days of my life in the damp dugout, I was unable to protest against this in any way. By then, as I later realized, I was already broken and had no resources to protest. And what kind of protest could I talk about when I was only 12 years old at the time? Strangely enough, I was not really depressed by my situation. After a while, my basement became comfortable. The man who locked me in there took mercy on me and made me a small wooden bench. And after some time, another person who supported my stay in the basement even gave me a warm blanket and a small, soft pillow. After that, my life in the basement did not seem as boring as it was before. I would like to thank you again for your care in the form of a bench, a warm blanket, and pillows, because that also played a huge role in my life. Not long before that, I had caught a cold in a damp basement and became very ill. I think my significant figures were afraid that I might die and then their future plans for me would fail. Tell me, Leah, please. You call these people just significant figures. What's the secret? What is their significance? Can you clarify this point? Asked a question by the host, Azy. Not many people will realize the significance of these people. In order for me to realize their role myself, I had to go through a lot of heavy emotions and thoughts. But I immediately tune into the fact that most will not understand this and will consider these people my tormentors. But believe me, as long as there is a tormentor in the world for you, you yourself will not cease to be a martyr. So for me, these people are neutral. But let's get on with it, Leah said. Yes, go on, said the presenter, Azy, and got closer to her interlocutor. In the damp basement, I had to get sick more than once, continued Leah. My skin was often covered with a terrible rash. There was a time when my hair fell out completely. After a short time living in the dark basement, I had already formed a certain worldview. My creepy habitat began to seem like the safest place for me. Sounds and noises from outside were occasionally heard. Now they scared me a lot. On days like that, I talked to myself. I repeated my mother's words that she used to say to me as a child. Don't be afraid of anything. Fear is just a gray cloud inside you. There is nothing dangerous on the outside. Period. See. My mother waved her hands in the air. Those words became a mantra for me. I could repeat the phrase fear within, not only out of fear, but also out of boredom or just singing along like clingy song lines. One day, someone came for me. No, this occasion was not remarkable. They came for me often and regularly. But this time there were unexpected events ahead of me. I learned the word gift for the first time. It was given to me by a strange woman whose house I came to clean. She had a huge house. There were many children and just as many pets. I usually didn't have time to clean her entire house in one day. When the day was over, the lady of the house would ask me to sit quietly in the yard. I usually sat like that for a few hours. When the time approached midnight, the landlady's son would start the car. The landlady would put me in the car, she would sit next to me, and I would be brought back to the dugout. Then this woman would go to my stepfather's wife, Wendy. They talked briefly about something. The woman gave something to Wendy and drove back with her son. They take me to the basement, take me inside and lock the door from the outside. I'd have to get some sleep and regain my strength before the next early morning. I've rarely been able to do that. Because of the constant lack of sleep and malnutrition, I often made mistakes in my work. I could trip and fall while cleaning. I could accidentally catch a bucket of dirty water on the floor that had just been cleaned. The next morning I had to wake up no later than 5 o'clock. How did I tell the time? I had to listen to the rooster call from the neighbor's yard. Rooster calls were hard to hear from the basement, especially if you were asleep. But Wendy said I had to hear it. So I made a habit of waking up a little before the rooster and waiting for the door to open and for Wendy to call me to come out. In the morning darkness, the owner of the big house and her son were waiting for me again. They would put me in the car and bring me to their house to continue cleaning from where I had finished yesterday. On one such day, the lady of the house came up to me and asked, "Leah, how old are you? Tell me, what is your favorite thing to do?" the woman asked. I didn't know what to answer. I had never really asked myself such a question before. What do I like? Do I have the right to determine what I like and what I don't like? Even if I knew what I liked, what would change? My childish psyche quickly came to this conclusion. I decided not to be distracted by such useless conversations and honestly said I didn't know. Then the woman walked over to the large closet I had just put in order and pulled out a small box from it. She opened the lid of the box and brought it very close to me. "Choose what you like here," said the woman. The box contained different jewelry, small magnets, toy tools, and many other things. My eye stopped on large white beads with feathers at the end. I stroked them gently with my finger. "Don't be afraid, take it." "It's a rosary," the woman said. "You can run your fingers over them and say prayers or other pleasant words. If you do it all the time, the words come true." Now I was really curious. I carefully took the rosary out of the box and began to finger the rosary with both hands. The woman took them out of my hands and showed me how to do it with one hand. "To avoid losing them when you are doing other things, you can put them around your neck or on your wrist," she said. I put the rosary around my neck, and the feathers were about chest height. "This is a gift for you," said the woman. I looked at her and could not fully understand her words. I knew I had to do something for it or say something. I couldn't articulate the thought, but the woman understood them herself. A gift means this thing stays with you. You don't have to pay for it. It's just that our family wants to make you feel good. You do so much for us, said the woman. I stood for a while with the rosary in my hands, and suddenly tears came to my eyes. By this time the woman had already left for another room, instructing me to continue cleaning. The next moment I was unable to contain myself. I roared at the top of my voice. The woman came running and asked me, "Leah, what's wrong, girl? Have you hurt yourself?" I shook my head and continued to sob, already crouched on the unfinished floor. The woman showered me with questions. She tried to remove my hands from my face, and she seemed tired eventually. "What on earth is this all about, huh? Does Wendy know you're such a crybaby? Are we bringing you here to cry here or something?" That's when I got scared and quickly got up off the floor. I apologized to the woman because I didn't want her to complain to Wendy, but I felt much lighter in my heart. I continued to do my cleaning. Whereas half an hour ago I had felt terribly tired, I felt much lighter now. I learned a new word, gift. I also learned that people can give something to other people for nothing. The world seemed more interesting than I thought it would be. There was another family where I was taken a lot, but I didn't clean there. I watered the plants in the garden. I liked that better than cleaning. In this small house lived an elderly woman and her elderly husband. I was very afraid of this old woman from the first days. She was stern. Her grandson and granddaughter, a girl my age and a slightly younger boy, sometimes came to visit her. While I was watering the plants in the vegetable garden, her granddaughter Willie often came up to me and called me to play with her. I liked that idea. I put my watering can on the ground and went off to play with Willie in the sandbox with the cute statues. Willie and I played for a long time. She had dolls. She played mother, I played daughter. Then we switched roles. Then we played friends who go shopping and buy things. Then a stern grandmother saw us. She shouted at me, "Hey girl, did they bring you here to play? Who's going to water the rest of my flowers? Look at her, she's shameless. She put the watering can on the ground and is having fun. You get back to work or I'll tell Wendy and let her deal with you." I was horrified that I'd made such a mistake. I threw the dolls in Willie's direction and went back to my work. Willie became sad, but she didn't mind her grandmother. I finished watering all the flowers toward evening. At that time, a stern elderly woman, moving with slow steps, was setting the table in the front yard of the house. "Have you finished watering?" "Then come here," she said. I ran to her and she led me into the kitchen of her house. There were many plates of food on the table. "Take 2 plates each and carry them carefully to the table in the yard. And don't drop anything," she said loudly. When I took 2 plates from the table, I felt the insanely delicious aroma of dishes unknown to me. It seems that one plate had fish in it, and the other had some kind of pastry cut into small pieces. I carefully placed the plates on the table and couldn't resist taking one piece of the flavorful pastry and putting it in my mouth. When I turned around, I saw a formidable grandmother right in front of me. She was holding a huge tray of plates. Then she put the tray on the table and looked at me with fury in her eyes. "What are you doing, you rude girl? Do normal people pull food from the table? Especially since I didn't give you permission to touch the food. Jimmy, get over here. Bring this plate to our dog in the enclosure and pour it all into his cup," she said to her grandson, Brother Willie. I felt insanely ashamed. I was even more ashamed of the delicious baked goods. Willie and Jimmy could enjoy it now, but now they were going to go without such a delicious treat because of me. When Jimmy returned with an empty plate, the stern woman turned to Willie. "You go ahead and put on more slices of pie yourself. It's with berries and honey. You'll like it. Go on, granddaughter." "No, Grandma, I don't want a pie with fillings," said Willie. And then Jimmy said he didn't want any. My amazement was unparalleled, how much they were missing out on by refusing this pie. But later, on another occasion, when I was brought to water the plants in the vegetable garden, Willie told me that her mother made this pie every day and she was tired of it. That was another revelation to me. At that time, Wendy and my stepfather would bring in once or twice a day the cooled leftover pasta or cold soup with lots of stale pieces of bread put in it. "Well then, sit down, Jimmy, or the chicken will get cold," said the stern woman. I stood by the table at a complete loss. At that moment, the husband of the stern lady of the house came out of the house and went to the table. I did not know his name. I mentally called him Good Grandpa, because he would sometimes stick up for me when his wife would yell and reprimand me for being slow. "And you, baby, why are you standing there? Sit down, eat with us," said the kind grandfather, sitting down at the table. I looked apprehensively at his wife. She nodded approvingly, and I sat down on the edge of the chair. Jimmy and Willie didn't want to eat at all. They were always playing with each other, throwing candy from the table at each other. The kind grandfather took out an empty plate, put a big piece of chicken meat and some vegetables in it, and moved it toward me. After a while, the stern woman asked me, "Leah, you're not Arthur and Wendy's own daughter, are you? Where are your parents?" My father was a doctor, respected by everyone. He wore glasses and read a lot at home. I remember him. We had a big house with a flowering garden. My mom and I used to relax there. She taught me to read and draw. And then Daddy was taken to prison. They said he had given a wrong injection and the man died in the hospital. Mom waited for him for a long time. She and I went to see Daddy in prison. It wasn't his fault. He told me that all the time. But then our grandmother came to our house and started living with us. She and Mom fought a lot. Then Mom decided to marry Arthur. Grandma decided to marry Arthur. Grandma didn't want to give me away, but I asked to go to Macondo with her. "Do you know where your mom was from?" "You look like a southern immigrant," said the stern woman. "Yes, I am. My grandmother and grandfather were from the South," my mother told me. At that moment, I was glad that this woman was also from the South, and knew some of my relatives. But that's not what she said. These immigrants are unpleasant people. There was a family like that living next door to us. Very unpleasant people. Very unpleasant. They were imposing themselves on us as friends. How insolent is that? The stern woman was indignant. Well, the kind grandfather again pleasantly surprised me. Said, well, that you just did not fall in love with this family. Does the value of a person depend on geography? There on the southern expanse of our country, too, the ratio of good and bad people is about the same, just like anywhere else on the planet, he said. No, dear, you're missing an important point. They didn't move here for the good life. They've been in chaos there for years. They can't elect a normal president. They can't elect a normal president. They can't get along among themselves. How are they going to get along with us? That says a lot. I think they're very quarrelsome, said the stern woman, taking a big bite of chicken leg. It's not because the people aren't nice. It's called politics. Unscrupulous politicians can wreak havoc in even the most prosperous country. It's not the people's fault. People suffer equally from it, said the good grandfather. While listening to their arguments, I finished all the food on my plate. The kind grandfather saw this and put some more meat on my plate. I kept waiting for the stern woman to say something unpleasant, but she didn't say anything. When everyone had eaten, I was told to clear the table. I washed the dishes and put them away. It was getting close to midnight. Someone knocked on the family's front yard. A stern-looking woman came out of the living room and said to me, "Hey, settler, I think they're here for you. Get your ass in gear." It was Wendy and my stepfather. The stern woman walked up to them and handed something into their hands. They put me in the car and took me home to take me down to the basement and lock me up. So on that day, I made another discovery for myself. The migrants, that is, I am here as not good people. I also learned that there may be other people who don't see it that way. I think I'm going on too long. Leah asked Daisy as if she had woken up. Izzy was watching her laptop. She looked up and said, "No, everything is fine. Continue your story, don't stop. We switched to live broadcast," said she. The stern woman came to pick me up many more times after that. Her grandsons Jimmy and Willie stopped coming after that. She sat alone all day long with her kind grandfather. One day when I was brought back to weed their front garden, the kind grandfather wasn't home either. I was afraid to ask the stern woman where her husband was. That day she didn't speak to me, and she didn't even shout or swear at me. In the evening she asked me to sit at her table and have dinner with her. She told me that her grandfather had died and her grandchildren had now transferred to a prestigious school in another country and could not come so often. This time, the stern woman was not so angry. She told me stories from her life. Turns out she grew up a round orphan. Raised by relatives, when she grew up, they sent her to work hard labor. When she got really sick, she was rescued by a mysterious guy she didn't know. Then this guy became her husband. He was that kind grandfather. That was the day I stopped being afraid of that harsh woman. Now, in my childish soul, instead of fear towards her, there was a kind of warmth, as if she knew my pain well. Suddenly she asked, "Do they buy you anything from your earnings? Because I see you've been wearing the same shirt for 3 years. They are too small for you." "What kind of earnings?" I asked, not understanding what I was talking about. "Oh, I see. Wendy's in charge. They don't just take you to different houses. You work there. You do the hardest work. And the owners of those houses pay money to your stepfather and his wife, Wendy. You didn't know that until now." The stern woman suddenly looked at me with pity. "No, I didn't. They don't talk to me about anything." Oh my God. Well, maybe that's right. You're still young. You could lose that money or spend it on something useless. But it will be good for you when you finish school and go to higher education, said the stern woman. I couldn't tell her that I only managed to go to school for 3 years while my mom was alive. After her death, Arthur accused me of trying to run away from home and locked me in the basement. Then his new wife came along, and she started sending me to work in different houses. I really wanted to study, to keep going to school. I had friends there, but now I couldn't even see them. I was specially taken early in the morning for different jobs and brought back at midnight, so that no one would notice that I had stayed in that house at all. I realized all this after a few years. Time passed and I was brought back to the house of a stern woman. Her son no longer came to pick me up. She called Wendy and asked her to bring me herself. I realized that the stern woman was all alone. I was still afraid to ask her name. I thought she might get angry at any second. This time I found her lying in bed. "There's no work for you today," she said. "You just stay at my house tonight. If you want, you can get something from the kitchen and eat. You want to go to the bathroom and wash up, but then come here and sit next to me." "Are you sick?" I asked. "Yes, I'm sick. I'm overcome with grief over my husband leaving me, and old age crept into my house unnoticed. There's no point in resisting. My doctor reassures me that the disease will pass. But I know the name of my disease. It won't go away. This disease will take me to my grave." "Not much left," she said, and groaned in great pain. The stern woman ate nothing. She sometimes seemed to move into another reality, talking to people who were not around. She talked to her parents. Sometimes she would call her husband by name, smiling and promising that she would come soon, asking him not to leave, to stay with her. It made me feel terribly scared. I barely waited until evening to be picked up by Wendy. In the evening, a stern woman called Wendy and said I would stay with her tonight. At night, I went to bed with her in the same room. She stayed up all night, in terrible pain and moaning. I often asked her if I could bring her medicine or water. She only made a gesture with her hand that she didn't need anything. Her pain did not subside until the morning. In the morning, she could talk better and even smile. That morning, she said to me, "Don't be afraid of anything. It happens. People die. When we are young and strong, we feel that the whole world belongs to us. And in this state, people are capable of making mistakes, of hurting others carelessly or deliberately. I'd like to apologize to you. Do you remember a few years ago when I told you I hated migrants? My perspective has changed since then. Settlers or locals, rich or poor, we're all just human beings in the end. Deep down, we all look alike. Different only in appearance, lifestyle, and transient views of a transient world. I'll be leaving this world soon, and you won't be coming to this house anymore. I wish you wouldn't hold a grudge against me. I have a lot of interesting things in my closet. Some jewelry. In the shelf you can choose any book. Let it be a gift from me," said the stern woman and turned to the wall. I sat next to her all day, not knowing how to help her. As the time approached evening, she was in pain again and began to suffer. I started crying because I didn't know how to help her, and I felt bad about her suffering too. So she called Wendy and asked her to pick me up early, said she didn't want me to suffer with her. She thanked me again, paid Wendy for my 2 days, and we left. I never came back to that house again. Leah, please tell me, did anyone know that you were being exploited in this way and locked up in the basement? No one knew that except the people I was taken to work for, but they were indifferent to my plight. I was afraid to complain to them. It wasn't until years later, when I was sorting it all out, the healer of human souls, that I realized that I was broken as a person. I was broken before I was formed as a person. Therefore, I had little thought of taking any steps. I was just suffering from longing, from loneliness, and from the coldness of my fate at that moment. I did not realize even then that people have the right to protest their suffering and start living differently. The childish world is incapable of such thinking, it seems. But let's leave my experiences for now. I want to talk about how I was learning about life even through such narrow possibilities. I have now begun to be brought to a new family. The rosary beads that another woman had given me, I always carried around my neck. I would go through them as I sat in the basement, reciting each time my mother's words that fear is only inside me. The new family had 2 children older than me. Their daughter was a student and barely spoke to me. The son's name was Romy. Romy was kinder to me. While I was cleaning the dog enclosure, Romy held the leash of an English Dane and rushed me. I was terribly afraid of that dog. I kept imagining how it would break out of Romy's hands and attack me. But Romy reassured me, "Don't be afraid, dogs are very smart and kind. And my dog obeys me completely, period," he said, and stroked his dog. But that didn't reassure me. I locked the door of the enclosure from the inside so that, God forbid, the dog would not come running until I finished cleaning. Looking at this, Romy only laughed. One time when he was holding his friend, the dog actually broke out of his arms. I saw it all with my own eyes. I was just glad that the enclosure door was locked from the inside at that moment, and the dog definitely can't break into me. Apparently, the English dog really wanted to have fun and ran towards the gate of the house. Romy caught up with it right at the gate and managed to grab the end of the leash. But the dog was not going to stop. In the next moment, the dog ran out of the gate, pulling the skinny Romy with him. I immediately remembered Romy's words that his dog obeyed him completely. I laughed and jumped out of the enclosure to remind him that he was not to be afraid of the dog, that he only obeyed him. I wanted to tease him with that kind of sarcasm. When I came out of the gate, the dog had dragged Romy far away from the house. He was running and screaming, asking for help, asking people to stop his dog. It made me feel really funny, and I started laughing out loud. It's a pity that Romy himself can't see himself from the outside. How funny he is now. After a moment, the dog and his funny owner were not visible at all. The dog ran to a neighboring street. I was curious to see the continuation of this show, so I ran after them. I found them in a nearby park. They were both tangled in the bushes. Apparently, Romy didn't want to let go of the end of the leash. He was sitting in a clearing, scratched up by the bush branches. The dog sat next to him with a guilty look. I understood what had happened without words and started laughing uncontrollably. At first, Romy was a little angry. Then he laughed too. Back home, we walked together. He asked me what school I went to. I told him honestly that I was not allowed to go to school. Romy promised to help me by talking to my stepfather and his wife. He said they were breaking the law by not letting me go to school. He advised me to go to the police. I pretended to agree with what he said, but I realized that I couldn't do it, that I was too afraid. I knew in my childish mind that if I had a conflict with Arthur and Wendy, there would be no one to stand up for me. Romy and I continued to be friends. He said he was looking forward to bringing me home with him. His parents didn't pay much attention to our friendship. I was interested in working with this family because Romy was always sitting nearby and telling me something interesting. At that time, I was 16 years old and Romy was 18. He was always upset that I continued not to go to school. I didn't want to discuss my problems with him. Next to him, I forgot about my life and my sufferings. In his company, I tried to listen to him as much as possible, to tell him something of my own that had nothing to do with my suffering. I liked that Romy and I could laugh a lot. One day, Romy asked me about my rosary beads. I told him their story. Then he took my rosary in his hands and looked at it with interest. The next time I went to their house, Romy gave me a beautiful pearl beads. He said that these beads were more suitable as jewelry and that I needed the rosary to go through. But when I arrived at the house, Wendy took the beads and my rosary at the same time. By then, I had no doubt that I had fallen in love with Romy. But I wasn't sure if Romy loved me. But I was sure he really liked me. Now my basement life was spent in endless waiting for Romy's parents to come and pick me up and take me up and take me up and take me to their house to work. On days like this, Romy would offer to let me stay to live at their house. He promised to talk to his parents to help me get a job at school again, to live with them, and then to go to the city to study with him. I realized that all this was unrealistic. It was enough that Romy had come into my life. Thanks to him, I had a vague confidence that someday my hell would end, that I could be a free man and see him whenever I wanted. But I had no idea when it would happen and in what way. Time passed and now I had very few free days. I was taken almost every day to a different house to do a different job. In most of the families, I managed to make friends with their children. I noticed then that children are more trustworthy than adults. Each of these children, despite the huge gap between us and me, took a keen interest in me. Some of them stopped as close friends to me. They shared their cute things, told me something about their lives, and constantly inquired about my life. When they learned of my strange fate, each of them offered to help me. I told them honestly that I was very afraid to complain about Arthur and Wendy, and they understood me. One of these days, they took me through the familiar streets and roads again. I was glad that I was being taken to Romy's family. When I arrived, a completely untidy house was waiting for me. I immediately started cleaning and waited for Romy to return from her studies. Evening came, but Romy didn't come. I didn't have time to finish all my chores that day, and I was glad of that. It meant that tomorrow I would come again, and maybe then I could see my Romy. The next day, he didn't show up at his house all day. When it was getting close to midnight and I had to go home, I cautiously asked Romy's mother where he had gone. She told me that Romy was now a student and was studying in the city at a prestigious university. I was in unbearable pain. I knew I couldn't live without him. Why didn't he tell me he was leaving? And how could he tell me? If I do not have access to the phone and other means of communication. So I immediately forgave him for that. But the thought of not having the one and only person in my life hurt my soul to the very core. As I left that house, tears rolled down my face and fell on my hands. Wendy and Arthur were talking passionately, counting the money that Romy's family had paid for my labor. Different people from different families sometimes gave me small gifts. I even managed to ask one family for a set of candles to light in my dark basement. But when I got home, Wendy took all the little things. If I wouldn't give them back, Arthur would step in. I'd been afraid of him since I was a little girl. When my mother married him, I didn't like him right away. Arthur would sometimes try to talk to me, but I wouldn't answer him. When I was little, he bought me toys, dolls, and drawing books. Before giving these gifts to me, he would ask me to call him Daddy. I refused this offer. I kept saying that my dad's name was Claire Colin, that he was a good doctor, that he would come and get me and my mom soon. My mom scolded me for saying that and told me not to say that to Arthur again. But I didn't want to forget my daddy. After that, Arthur stopped buying me presents. I missed my dad very much. Then, after my mom married Arthur, my mom and I stopped going to see him in prison. One day when I was 8 years old, I decided to go to see him in prison myself. True, I didn't know the way because we had moved to another town to see Arthur. But I knew I could ask one of the adults to show me the way to the prison. I left the house early in the morning like I was going to school. The day before at my teacher's school, I told her that tomorrow we were having a family event and I was skipping school. The teacher didn't object. After fooling all the adults, I went to meet my dad. In my backpack, I put all my drawings that I drew when he was away. He was the one who taught me how to draw when I was a kid. He and I used to draw together a lot. I really miss those days. After leaving the house, I headed straight for the big road that leads to the city. I stood along the big road and started catching passing cars. I stood for a very long time. No one wanted to stop and take me to the neighboring town. Then I thought that people might think I didn't have any money with me, but I did have money. My mom gave me money for pocket money. Sometimes Arthur gave me some money. I put it all away and saved up. When no car wanted to stop, I took all my money out of my pocket and held it in my outstretched hand. I wanted the drivers to see that I had money, that I could pay my fare. Finally, after a while, one car stopped a few meters away from me. I ran towards it. 2 young men were sitting in it. "Hello, please take me to Macondo." "I will pay you money. I have money." I showed my money in my hands. The men laughed and one of them asked me, "Girl, why are you going to Macondo alone? There's a prison there, and my daddy is in it. I miss him very much. My mom and I used to go to see him, but now my mom says that Arthur will get mad if we go to see my dad, said I. Does your mom know you're going to your dad's by yourself now? The other man asked. She doesn't need to know. I'm going to visit my dad, and I'll be home in the evening. I'll tell my mom that after school I went to play on the field with my friends. Please pick me up, or I might not make it back before tonight, I begged. The men looked at each other. The one who was driving leaned close to the other's ear and whispered something. Then the other one turned to me and said, No, girl, we can't take you with us. It is very dangerous for a little girl to go to a distant town alone. You should go back to school or home now. After these words, the man closed the car door, and they drove away at high speed. It made me cry. I was ready to pay them. I'm big enough. I've been to that prison before. It's been so long since we went to see my dad, he must have missed me. All these words I said out loud. I crouched down along the big road and started crying loudly. After a while, I heard a shout behind me. Hey, girl! Is there any adult with you? A few meters away from me, another car stopped and a woman got out of it. When I turned around, she was already heading in my direction. I got excited and ran to meet her. Please take me with you all the way to Macondo. I will pay you money. Here I have enough, said I, and pulled out all my money to her. Where's your mom? Who are you going to the city with? The woman asked, squatting down in front of me. I'm going alone. I'll go there for a while, and then I'll be back in the evening, just to visit my dad. He's in jail. Mom and I haven't visited him for a long time. He must really miss me, and I miss him too. I can't take it anymore, I said, and kept crying. My God, why didn't your mom come with you? She let you go alone. My mom doesn't know. She thinks I went to school, but I don't want to upset her. I'll take a quick trip to town, and I'll be home tonight. Please take me to town. The woman stared at me, then wiped a tear from my cheek. Now we'll think of something. You stay here, I'll be back, said the woman, and again headed back to her car. After a couple minutes, she got out of the car and shouted in my direction. Girl, get in, let's go. There was no limit to my joy. There was another woman in the car, and they were talking to each other the whole way, asking me questions from time to time. I told them about my dad. On the way, we stopped in a small town. The women said that here we could stretch our muscles. I got out of the car with them. We had a bite to eat there. I held my money still in my hand so the adults would believe me. But the two women paid for my snack along the road and didn't charge me. Onward we drove for some more time. I often warned the woman who was driving to be sure to remind me when we were close to the prison. She promised that she would. Finally, we pulled into town. I started bouncing quietly on the spot with joy. The time was still early, and I was sure I'd make it home before evening. The car circled around the city, then stopped in front of a tall building. Police cars were parked around the building, and there were police officers in small groups standing near the building. I thought the prison looked a little different. The building was not so big, and there were not so many police cars. But I trusted these women. I thought they knew the city better. One of them got out of the car and asked me to wait. The second one stayed next to me. A couple minutes later, the first woman came out of a high-rise building with two policemen. They walked up to the car, opened the door, and one of the policemen said, Well, hello, Leah girl. You made it. Come on, get out of the car. I quickly jumped out of the car and hurried to say goodbye to the woman who brought me here. Thank you very much. Here, take the money, I said. The woman smiled back, patted my hair, got into the car, and drove off. Two policemen took me to a high-rise building. We went up the floors through long corridors and came to a large office where there were several other policemen. One of them sat me down at a table across from him, took a piece of paper and a pen, and started asking me questions. So, your name is Leah? I nodded my head in response. Leah, where are you going now? I repeated all my answers again, which I had to tell everyone several times today. The policeman asked me many more questions and wrote down my answers. He asked me the names of my relatives, my mom, my dad, my stepdad, and the whole history of our family. I was sure to the last minute that this policeman was going to talk to me and take me to the meeting place in the prison. It's usually a small room where they take my dad out, but the conversation with the policeman was very long. He asked the same questions several times. I felt tired, but I didn't give up. I periodically asked the policeman about my dad. He ignored my questions. When quite some time had passed, the policeman said that he had called my mom and informed her that they had called my mom and informed her that they had me. My disappointment was unparalleled. So these two women had tricked me and brought me to the police station. I was doubly hurt that my mom would find out that I had deceived her. Even the teacher would now know that I had deceived her. I started sobbing again in my voice. All the sitting policemen took turns to comfort me. One of them gave me a chocolate bar. Another one took his cap off his head and put it on my head. He started to say that it suited me very well, that I was a very beautiful and smart girl, that he had a daughter like me. If you end up in prison, will you miss your daughter? Through tears, I asked the policeman. The policeman did not answer anything. He turned away and went to his workplace. After a while, my mom came running with Arthur. She thanked the policeman and took me home. When we got into Arthur's car, I started crying again. Then my mom scolded me and told me to sit quietly. She promised that we would talk about everything at home. After that incident, Mom and Arthur started to control me a lot. Now it was impossible to go anywhere without their accompaniment or permission. As the years passed, I began to get used to the idea that I would only be able to see my dad when I was an adult. One day, Mom got sick and stopped going to work. Arthur brought the doctor home, but he told Mom to go to the city hospital. Mom spent almost 2 months in the hospital. During that time, I tried to sneak away from Arthur 2 more times to visit Daddy in jail, but both times he caught me and brought me home. Back home, he scolded me a lot. Said I was upsetting my mom with my antics. And if I keep acting like this, Mom will never get better. For Mom's health, I promised not to run away to the city on my own anymore. Mom finally came home from the hospital. But she didn't come by herself. They brought her in a doctor's car. She was lying down. The doctors helped Arthur get my lying mom into the house, gave him a big list of medicines, patted her on the shoulder, and left. I kept waiting for my mom to get out of bed. She told me every day that she was already getting better and better. In the evening, I would go to bed with her by my side and fall asleep in her bed. I would often wake up at night and see my mom in pain. Arthur would sometimes get up and give her medicine. Then he would go into the other room and fall into a deep sleep. On one such night, she would not let me lie down next to her. She urged me to sleep in her room tonight. That night, Arthur stayed beside her instead of me. In the morning, he woke me up and told me that my mother had died. From that day on, life stopped for me. I didn't have the energy to go to school. I didn't want to see my friends. Arthur would leave for work and come back in the evening. He was angry that I didn't do anything around the house. I begged him to send me to my grandmother, who was probably still alive and living at my dad's house. But he ignored all my pleas. Now Arthur assigned me a list of chores every morning when he left for work, but I still didn't do them. So he would punish me in the evening by locking me in the closet of his house. I'd stay there until morning. Sometimes he'd go to work without letting me out of the closet. By evening, I was already very hungry and was ready to do the housework to avoid being in the closet again. But my strength was not enough for long. I again lost the desire to do anything. I could just sit quietly in a corner of the house for hours and do nothing. This annoyed Arthur terribly, so I decided to get out of here no matter what. I made a plan. First, I would visit my dad in prison. Then I would go to my grandmother, his mother. She may not have liked me and my mom much, but she's closer to me now than Arthur. But I had no money for my plans. When Arthur wasn't home, I went to our neighbor, an old woman named Betty. I asked her for money, and in return I promised to do any work on her house, because it was the only thing I could thank her for. Betty promised to think about it and give me an answer in a couple days. I began to look forward to that day. Everything changed in a completely different direction. Exactly 2 days later, Arthur came home from work very angry, took me by the hand, and dragged me to the basement for the first time. He took me into the basement and said, "Sit down here and think hard. Either you will behave well, study diligently, and do everything around the house. Then I will let you go to town at your 18th birthday, as your mother asked. And if you run away to the city now, beg money from the neighbors, and idle all day long, you will have nothing," said Arthur, and slammed the wooden cellar doors. Following him, I begged him not to leave me here. The cellar smelled damp and it was completely dark inside. I was unbearably scared, cold and resentful. After that, Arthur appeared, it seemed to me 2 days later. He brought me some food and some clothes. He didn't say anything, locked the door and went back out. Sometimes I'd scream at the top of my voice, hoping someone from the street would hear me. But at such times it was usually only Arthur who heard me. He would come and scold me again. Every protest increased my time in that basement. And in the basement, every second of my life was unbearable. One day, a new person came down to the cellar instead of Arthur. It was a woman. She took me outside, sat me at a table in the front yard, and we met her. It was Wendy, Arthur's new wife. She tried to sound friendly, but she only repeated Arthur's words. I hoped she seemed kinder than Arthur and would let me go to my loved ones. But it was all in vain. At the end of the conversation, I cried from frustration. Wendy got very angry and dragged me by force to the basement. So nothing in my existence changed. But after a few hours, Wendy brought me a pillow, a blanket, some of my things, and some food. She seemed to notice that, at that point, I was very sore from the damp and cold. I guess she spared me. The next day, Arthur brought me a wooden bench into the cellar, and then I realized I was here for the long haul. After a while, I decided to give up and asked Arthur to let me out. I promised that I would go to school again, that I would do everything around the house, that I wouldn't run away to the city anymore. But he didn't believe me anymore. He wouldn't even talk to me anymore. "There will be something for you only a little later," said Arthur briefly, and left the basement. After these words, for the first time, I was released. Free how? It was my first experience of slavery. Wendy had explained to me from the evening that tomorrow I would go to a house, and there I would do whatever I was told. Then I wasn't taken to a house, but to a tobacco plantation. There were many people working there. I was assigned a separate plot and told not to go near other people, and to finish my plot as quickly as possible. Naturally weakened and sick, I could not finish this plot in today's day, or in 3 days, or even in a week. The man who took me out of the cellar every morning told Wendy and Arthur in the evening that I was doing a very bad job. They didn't say anything in response, but they started bringing me more food. Apparently, it was important to them that I work better so they would get more money, and I expected them to punish me. One day, Arthur and Wendy had visitors at their house, and they stayed a long time. Usually the stomping of people in the yard and their conversations could be heard from the basement. I noticed that for the past few days there were not just 2 people living in the house, many more. Judging by the voices, they were all grown men. I was still taken early in the morning to different houses or fields, brought back at midnight. I never had a chance to see any of the strangers. Once at midnight, when I was brought in after an exhausting day's work, I noticed something interesting out of the corner of my eye. The window in Arthur's house was ajar. Wendy and Arthur had come out to get paid for my labor and quickly ushered me into the basement. During this time, I managed to see a faint silhouette standing at the open window. I didn't pay much attention to it, but after a while I learned that it was in that instant that my life changed in a completely different direction. By then, I had gotten used to my lifestyle. With some of those people who took me to work, I even became a bit of a friend. But still, I was afraid to ask them for help, and they were not really interested in my fate. A few days later, deep in the night, when I had just come in after a hard day's work, someone knocked on the wooden doors of the basement. I was frightened. I thought that the owners of the house I was working in today had complained to Arthur and Wendy. and perhaps they had come to scold and reprimand me again. But it's odd that a man is the one knocking on the door. And Arthur and Wendy have their own keys. They would have opened the door and come right in. I went close to the door and began to listen. After a while, the knocking came again. I was afraid to utter a voice and continued to stand at the door. Then a man's voice asked quietly, "Is there anyone here?" I realized that it was the voice of a complete stranger. "Yes, there is. And who are you?" I asked warily. "You don't know me, but I've been watching you for a few days when you were brought to this house and taken away. I've noticed that they take you to the basement. Are you in trouble?" the voice asked almost in a whisper. I realized that the stranger was also wary of Arthur and Wendy. "Yes, I'm locked in here. Early in the morning, I'm taken to work in different houses or in the fields. They bring me in late at night on purpose so no one can see me. I came to this house many years ago with my mother. After my mom died, the owner of this house forbade me to leave the house. As punishment, he put me here. I still live here," I said. "What is your name and how old are you?" the man asked. I told him my name, my age, and just in case I told him my grandmother's approximate place of residence, and even managed to tell him about my father, who is in prison without guilt. The man promised that he would find a way to get me out of the basement, then hurried away before the owners of the house noticed. The next morning, people came to get me, and getting into the car, I again saw the silhouette of this man in the open window, who was watching the whole process. I was sure that it was this man who had knocked on my door at night. I didn't know if he could help me. For the next few days, Arthur and Wendy's lodgers were unheard of. I had given up hope of rescue. The stranger must have tried to save me, but it didn't work. By then I had no time to think long and hard. I was so tired during the day at my various jobs that at night, when I arrived in the cellar, I fell into a deep sleep. But suddenly, there was another knock on the cellar door. I quickly got up and went to the door. At that moment, the door opened. The bright light of the lantern blinded me. I couldn't see who was standing in front of me. An unfamiliar voice said to me, "Let's get out of here quickly." Before I could think of anything, I grabbed the stranger's hand, and he tiptoed me up the cellar stairs. We walked carefully across the courtyard. When we reached the gate, the man did not open it. Next to the gate was a mound of bricks. The stranger helped me onto the slide, then told me to climb over the wall. As I climbed over the wall, another man's hands grabbed me from the other side. I didn't have time to get my feet on the ground. These hands carried me to a car that was standing a few meters away. Before that, I had time to hear my savior following me also climb over the wall and jump to the ground with a clatter. The two strangers put me in the car, and it started without turning on the headlights. When I opened my eyes, I found myself in a small, very clean, bright, and cozy room. I was lying in a cozy bed with a clean and soft pillow. The linen smelled fresh, not the dampness I was used to. There was a table by the bed covered with a white cloth. I lifted the cloth slightly and saw breakfast. I didn't have a bad feeling in my heart, though I didn't remember much about last night or how I'd gotten here. Apparently, I'd fallen asleep right after the car started. After a while, there was a soft knock on the door of the room. I froze in surprise, and the next moment the door opened and a middle-aged man in a long black robe came in. Only then did I realize that I was in a church. "Greetings, Leah. You are finally free. My name is Eric, and I'm preaching to the congregation of this church. You can stay here as long as you want, but there is one important condition. You must participate in all the sermons, and if possible help to keep the church clean and orderly." "What should I do now?" I asked, as I was used to getting straight to work. Eric smiled and said, "You don't have to do anything today. I told the Matushkas about you. Later they will show you where you can wash and change. The sermon will start only in 2 days, and when you need help in the household, you will be informed beforehand." "Eric, how did you find out about me? How did you get into Arthur's house? How did you manage to get the key to the basement? Arthur and Wendy always carry the keys to the basement with them," I asked. Eric told me that a month ago, Arthur himself had been rescued to house some preachers. While the preachers were living at Arthur's house, Eric, thanks to his natural vigilance, had noticed the strange morning and midnight activities of the owners of the house. Eavesdropping at the window, he realized that someone was being sent out to work and was being paid for it. But this person was not seen in the house by the preachers. Then Eric cautiously followed and saw me being led into the basement. Thus ended my existence in slavery. Lee finished her story and asked Daisy, "I think I've been narrating for a very long time. Surely your viewers are getting tired?" Izzy turned and looked at Bob, who had already sat down next to the set, put aside all his gadgets and listened attentively. Bob made a gesture with his hands towards Izzy, who turned on her microphone and turned to Lee. "Our viewers write that they are very interested in listening to your story. Many of them are overwhelmed with emotion. I think it would be better if you tell the rest of your story," said Izzy. "But before that, let me ask you a question. You put up with so much trouble from Arthur and Wendy, and now you're thanking them. I think the police should prosecute and punish these people. Why do you feel grateful to them?" "You're quite right," Leah continued. "For a long time, I myself have dreamed that Arthur and Wendy would be punished by the law. But further events in my life have changed my attitude to everything. I tried to take an active part in the economic life of the church, but I was not very good at studying and listening to sermons, because I had only 3 grades of education. I even forgot letters, forgot how to read and how to count. So I secretly dreamed of continuing my education in a secular school, but I did not have such an opportunity yet. After a short time, I was entrusted with almost all the economic affairs of the huge church. I was told that I was surprisingly good at what I did. Indeed, I could do any job for 3 people in my 18 years. But my problems did not end there. Strangely enough, once I was in a favorable environment, I was unable to sleep well at night. I kept dreaming of a dark, damp basement. I dreamed of Arthur and Wendy chasing me almost every night, and I often woke up in a terrible state. It was even more difficult for me to get along with people. I had a terrible impatience with them. They were used to long conversations with each other, and I was already tired of any person after a few minutes, and I wanted to seclude myself in my room. This made it very difficult for me to get used to living among people. But the people in the church were all very friendly, and whoever I told my problems to, they led me to different icons and advised me to pray. I prayed and was released for a while, but then the problems returned with renewed vigor. After a couple of months of living in the church, I was horrified when I realized that I didn't know how to live among people at all. Strangely enough, I even began to miss my old detached way of life. But I prayed hard and asked God to help me learn to live among people. On one of those days, I had a dream. My mother was in it. In the dream, I see myself from the outside praying in the church. The picture is the same as the night before, but in my dream, my mom is present next to me in the church. She silently looks at me while I pray and waits. Then she hands me a beautiful box that is locked with a key. She says it is God's gift to me for my prayers. I try to open the beautiful box, but find that it is locked. And then I realize that Mom still has the key to the lock of the box. Mom was just leaving the church. I run after her to ask her for the key to the box. She turns sharply in my direction and shouts, threateningly, that I shouldn't run after her. I yell back that I just want to remind her that she forgot to give me the keys to the jewelry box. She says, "Go to the market and you'll find the key on the way." Then she adds that I might not find the key if you're inattentive and not diligent like this. Without explaining, it was a vivid dream. I remembered it to the smallest detail. The next day, before I woke up, I was asked to go to the nearest market and buy some things for the church. Back from the market, I walked with 2 weighty bags in my hands. Now and then I stopped, but I was in a hurry to get the necessary products in time for lunch. While I was standing on the sidewalk and looking thoughtfully at the surrounding space, I saw a strange picture from the opposite road. A man was walking as if the earth was spinning under his feet. That's how very drunk people usually walk. but he was dressed like my dad when I was a kid. A strict suit and a big black folder in his hands, I think. He didn't look like a hobo or a drunk in any way. He was having trouble staying upright. He was obviously in a hurry. I realized from the direction he was moving that he was in a hurry to cross the road faster. Almost falling to the ground, he managed to reach the sidewalk. Thankfully, the green light had just turned green, and he had time to cross the road. I watched him carefully, not reaching the middle of the road. The man stopped. Now it seems that he was looking for a foothold so that he wouldn't fall. People passing by were frightened away from him and quickened their steps. He tried to lean against the cars in front of the traffic light, but they were making loud signals so that the man would not block their way. The next moment the light turned red and the cars started honking at the man even more vigorously. He was still not giving up, trying to reach the sidewalk. When he made a decisive step, he seemed to run out of strength and the man fell right in the middle of the roadway. Cars honked and rearranged their path to go around him. Passers-by on the sidewalk stopped for a moment and discussed among themselves, "Oh, drunkard, you've lost your mind. What are the police looking at? These vagrants are walking freely in the city. If he had been drinking, he should lie at home, not wander the streets and fall under the wheels." Each of the passers-by felt like a judge for a moment and went on their way. I couldn't stand by and watch this. I left both my bags right on the sidewalk and ran into the roadway. The drivers who were just angry at the man lying there seemed to get even angrier. When they saw me, some of them even started shouting something out of their car windows. But I had no intention of stopping. I made a gesture with my two hands, asking the drivers to slow down. They were angry and indignant, but they slowed down. I got to the man. He was lying face down. I turned his body and laid him on his back. His body went cold. I had absolutely no knowledge or skill in first aid, but I clearly realized that if other people wanted to help this man, right now there was a lot they could do for him as well. In all critical cases in my life, I had the only weapon. Period. I decided to use it. As in a distant childhood, I stood in the middle of the road, began to shout loudly, sobbing and crying, asking for help from those who could hear. Meanwhile, the man's face turned blue. He was dressed very respectably, no signs of alcoholism or vagrancy on him. The man obviously had health problems, so he was trying to cross the road faster and get to safety. When the red light for cars came on again and all cars stopped, people could no longer remain indifferent to my hysteria. A young man got out of his car and came running to help. I told him that I didn't know what had happened to him and what to do next, but continued to yell at the top of my voice that I needed to help the man immediately. The young man tried to lift the man from his seat, but he was not very good at it. Then I started shouting even louder, and two of the passers-by stopped and helped the man into the young man's car. I returned to the church in the evening. I honestly told them that I was trying to help the man. Eric encouraged me. He also told me that one of the parishioners had brought 2 bags of groceries from the street for charity. I looked at the bags and realized that God himself had made sure that the groceries were delivered to the church on time. Truth be told, someone else got a thank you for doing so. That's how divine will works, I thought to myself. A few days later, I decided to visit the rescued man in the hospital. I was really curious about what had happened to him. At the hospital, I learned that his name was Eduard. Like my father, works as a doctor. He told me himself that he had been working too much lately, overworking himself at his job. As a result, he brought himself to a pre-stroke state. While I was telling his story, Eduard often thanked me and kept repeating that, in this case, time had decided a lot. He was lucky that he was quickly taken to the hospital and his colleagues were able to save him from a stroke. Everything turned out without tragic consequences. At the end, Eduard asked me how he could thank me. I just smiled back and said that I just did what an ordinary person should have done. Eduard said that my answer had touched him even more. He asked about me, but I didn't tell him much about myself so as not to tire him out. Then he handed me his card and asked me to contact him after a while. I didn't come to Eduard's office to receive any gratitude from him. I was terribly curious to see what a real doctor looks like in the working process. I wanted to look at Eduard and complete the image of my father in my head. I still couldn't find the strength to visit my father in prison, even though I'd been out for months. Oddly enough, there was no sign in Edward's office that he was a doctor. Honestly, I expected to see shiny medical instruments, big pictures with drawings of human organs. That's how my father worked. His gadgets in our house have been preserved to the last. Edward explained to me that he doesn't treat people's bodies, but their souls. I was very interested in how a doctor could treat a person's soul. He said that I would understand it later and asked me to tell more about myself. I told my whole story, and for the first time I met a man for whom my story was really interesting. Edward never once interrupted me, but on the contrary asked me more and more questions. In the end, I did not notice how I began to tell the most painful moments of my past. Edward showed such human sympathy and compassion that I could not hold back my tears. I sobbed in that office like I had never sobbed in my life. After some time had passed, Edward said that he would like to see me every week or every 3 or 4 days in his office to have a heart. To heart talk like this. When I left Edward's office, I felt a sense of relief in my soul. Since I was not busy at church, I had no problem coming to Edward's office. I told him about all my current problems. I told him that I had nightmares, that I couldn't stand people, that I often fought because I wanted to close myself off from everyone and not go anywhere. I told that at the same time, I want to live like everyone else. I want to continue my studies. I want to go to see my relatives at last. I want to find my grandmother and hope that she is alive. Edward listened attentively and helped me to understand myself better. He helped me to say things that I could never do on my own. And amazingly, I found it easier and easier to talk about everything each time. It wasn't until some time later that I felt empowered. I started to think that I could set a goal for myself and achieve it. It was a completely new experience for me. I realized that it was time to start studying. Overcoming my shyness and awkwardness, I went to the nearest educational school. The principal of the school looked at me with wide, surprised eyes. In general, we accept children in the 4th grade at the age of 9. 10 years old, this is the first time in my practice when an adult wants to study in the lower grades. I had to tell my story briefly. The principal listened, then sat thoughtfully for a while and suggested I come back again in a week. I had no idea myself how I could continue my education, how I could fill the gap of almost a decade when I was about to be 19 years old. A week later, when I reported to the principal, she offered me her vision. You don't need to go through the entire school program. I would suggest that you individually make arrangements with our teachers to give you personalized lessons at an accelerated pace outside of school hours. I would ask that they put together an individualized program for you. This way you can get the foundation of a high school education in 1-2 years. But I warn you right away, it will cost you a certain amount of money and effort. Effort didn't scare me. But I did not yet have a vision of how to solve the money issue. After talking with Edward, I decided to postpone this issue for a while. In general, at that time my life began to change rapidly for the better, and I believe that each of my dreams has a chance to come true. You just need to be patient and allow the flow of fate to present everything in the best way. Eric, the church preacher, sometimes gave me some money and told me I could buy something for myself with it. I didn't spend that money and saved it. That day I told Eric honestly that I wanted to go to the prison and visit my father. He assigned me one of the women who lived in the church like me. I was overjoyed. It turned out that my companion used to live where the prison was located. We got there quickly enough. The hardest part was waiting for permission from the prison staff to meet my father. First they said I had to apply in advance to meet my father. Then I started crying, begging again, and telling my story that I hadn't seen my father for 15 whole years. Then one of the prison guards asked me why my father was imprisoned. I told him that he'd given someone the wrong injection, and they'd died. Then your father should have been out of prison at least 10 years ago, said the guard. And I really didn't know how many years my father had been in prison. Now my plans changed. and I decided to go straight to my home. When my mom and I moved from there to Arthur's, my grandmother was alone. If my dad had already managed to get out of jail, then at least my grandmother and my dad must be living in that house. For the last 15 years, I was sure that I could find my father's house with my eyes closed. But it turned out that a lot of things had changed in the area, and I couldn't even navigate the streets. My companion and I circled the village streets for a long time. At last, I saw the old school, where I myself used to go to school. My house was 3 streets away from the school. Now I remembered exactly. Nothing had changed in my house since then. It was very old and looked much smaller than it had when I was a child. As I approached the gate of my house, my anticipation was replaced by doubt. In front of the gate of my house, I saw the grass was thickly overgrown. It looked as if no human had set foot here for a long time. I pounded on the metal gate until my arms ached. The loud bell that always woke me up as a child didn't seem to work anymore. I walked over to the mailbox and saw a stack of newspapers and magazines inside. The ink had dripped from them. The pages had stuck together and turned into a single gray mass. That's what very old books look like in attics or abandoned closets. I was no longer under any illusions about my grandmother and father. When I lost all hope, I decided to knock on the gate of the neighboring house. My friend Lindsay, her mom Evelyn, and her dad lived there. I used to play a lot as a child in this house. Evelyn treated me just like she treated her daughter Lindsay. I wonder if she recognizes me now. My knock was answered quickly enough from inside the house. A moment later, the metal gate opened, and there stood before me a woman of advanced years, not recognizing me or suspecting anything. But I recognized her at once. Aunt Evelyn. I'm Leah, the daughter of Claire and Asteria Collin of this house. Remember me? Aunt Evelyn looked as if she had just received an electric or mechanical blow to the head. She first froze for a moment, then opened her arms wide. She and I stood like that for a while, and she seemed to know what I was about to ask. She beat me to it and invited me into her house. Without waiting for my questions, Aunt Evelyn told me everything herself. My grandmother had lived with me for 5 years after my mother and I left. She missed me until the last days of her life. She bequeathed me her beautiful velvet trunk. Aunt Evelyn told me that the year my grandmother died, my dad was released from prison. But he came back from prison a different man. He contracted a terrible disease there and couldn't work as a doctor anymore. He fought for life for about a year and died in that house too. That evening, I decided to stay at Aunt Evelyn's with my companion. Aunt Evelyn and I talked until morning. Then she pulled out of the depths of the closet my grandmother's wooden chest, which closes with a small key. The key, it turns out Aunt Evelyn kept in the pages of her papers so she wouldn't lose it. She said that everyone here believed that I would come back to this house someday, so they had no doubts. I decided to open my grandmother's will later, when I could finally come to terms with what I had heard. When I got back to town, I couldn't wait to tell Edward. He was helping me to talk things out and understand myself better and better. If it weren't for him, I might never have learned to live among people, and I would not have been able to find loved ones, to make plans, to overcome my nightmarish memories, to accept my pain. Edward helped me to cope more quickly with the new truth of my life. If I had lived my dreams of seeing my father and grandmother before, now I had to learn to live for myself. Later I found their graves and periodically visited them there. Immersed in my disappointment, I had forgotten about my grandmother's chest. One evening I was reminded of it by one of my church friends. So I decided to open it up and take a look. I was sure my grandmother had most likely bequeathed her most dear to my heart jewelry and personal items to me. As a child, she had tried to teach me needlework by showing me everything on her in tools. In the trunk, yes, there really were all of my grandmother's prized possessions. Even her needles, hooks, and thimbles. Underneath were her photographs, pictures dear to my heart. There were also pictures of my father at various ages, including his wedding to my mother. When the photos were finished, right at the very bottom of the chest was a huge, thick paper bag, sealed all around the edges. The outside was labeled for Leah Collin and signed by my grandmother. I opened the paper bag and there was the deed to my grandmother's house. She had made a will in my name and given it to a neighbor, but that wasn't all. There was a bank check with details in my name. It turned out that my grandmother had left me a considerable amount of money. Since then, I have been challenged to find something in life that is worth striving for the best. Immediately after I learned about the death of my father and grandmother, it was not an easy task. But Edward turned out to be a very skillful soul healer. He spent many hours of soulful conversations with me, listened to all my thoughts. In the end, each time he convinced me that life was worth living. Edward sometimes suggested that I do something that brings me joy. So I suddenly discovered that I had forbidden myself to be happy for a long time. It started under the influence of Arthur and Wendy. But it's strange that it continues after they've disappeared from my life irrevocably. In telling all these stories, Leah Collin was surprisingly calm. In some places, she glowed with joy and happiness. In other places, she discreetly wiped tears from her eyes, but on the whole, she remained unperturbed. This spoke of the girl's great personal strength. She was perfectly able to withstand her own heaviest emotions, which is not possible even for every mature person. Then Edward brought me back again and again to the question of what I could do best. Again, unexpectedly, I found out that I liked to face chaos and turn it into harmony. Therefore, I could take on any job with great zeal and do it like no one else. Edward and I had a long discussion to find an activity that would help me develop in this direction. This will be your shortest and most deserved path to success, Edward kept telling me. So I went to study to become an architect designer. But for me, this path was not easy, given that I had only 3 classes of education, and the rest I got by my own efforts. But that's a separate story. In the process of my education, my teachers were very surprised how I, being a girl, could so cleverly understand the soil, rocks, and trees. None of them had any idea that I had grown up caring for such things. Leah, what happened to your first love, Romy? Did you never get to meet him? Hazy asked. Oh, I forgot to tell you about him, Leah smiled. Her face instantly lit up. I'll answer your question about why I feel grateful to Arthur and Wendy. I got some of my grandmother's money and paid my teacher's tuition. I was doing great. I mastered the lessons well and gained confidence in my knowledge pretty quickly. Then, on a wave of inspiration, I went to college to study design and architecture with great difficulty, but through sheer perseverance. A lot of things changed in me. My life was transformed beyond recognition. I had girlfriends, friends, teachers. I went to church as my second home, and I lived permanently in my house in the city. But one thing that remained constant was my feelings for Romy. I dreamt about him a lot, and always in the same image. We are happy together, but between us some emptiness and distance. We are drawn to each other. And with Edward, I was living a separate parallel life. It was much more complicated. In this inner life of mine, at that moment, I felt a great hatred and anger toward Arthur and Wendy. I wanted to confront them and say all the words I had not been able to say in 15 years. One day I decided to do it. I was drowning in my hatred for them. I was ready to tear them to pieces right in their house and then let it be, I thought. I hired a car to Arthur's town and headed to their house closer to evening. It was early summer. We reached the painfully familiar streets and the gates of the house. But my cab couldn't get close to Arthur's house because 2 cars were already parked at his gate. One of them was a police car. The gate was wide open. There were lights on in all the rooms in the house, and there seemed to be a lot of people. I was afraid that something had happened to Arthur or Wendy. Maybe I hadn't arrived at the right time. I decided to stay in the cab and see what was going on. After a while, people started to leave Arthur's house. I saw the faces of his neighbors there. The policemen got into their car and drove away. The neighbors went to their homes. There was only one car left, with people behind it, and it was impossible to see their faces. I got out of the cab and came closer. It was already dark, and hardly anyone would have noticed me. But I recognized the voices clearly. They were the voices of Arthur and Wendy, desperately fawning, swearing, and assuring someone of their innocence. The next instant, it was as if lightning had struck my head. I recognized another voice. I couldn't believe my ears. It was my Romy's voice. Dumbfounded by what I heard, I decided to creep even closer. Once I was near the car behind which these people were talking, I clearly understood that Romy was demanding that Arthur and Wendy find me immediately. They both swore by the name of all that was holy that I wasn't in their house and that I had run off somewhere long ago. Romy continued to disbelieve them and threatened that he would find me and punish them for all their actions. After that, Romy promised Arthur and Wendy more visits to their house with the police. Then he headed towards the car. Arthur and Wendy hid behind their gate. My Romy stood a few meters away and lit a cigarette. "Romy, I'm here." I barely had time to say it and ran to meet him. Our gazes met in the light of the burning street lamps. We stood embraced in the night street for a long time. We were on our way back to the city together at night. Romy told me that this was not the first time he had come to Arthur's house with the police to rescue me from slavery. He thought they might have sold me somewhere or, God forbid, killed me and hidden me. So he was inconsolable in his search. Romy asked if I would write to the police to punish these people. I said that I didn't want to cause unpleasant emotions, first of all to myself. Everything that was in the past was in the past. Everything I needed, I took with me into the future. And it's with me, in the present. It was my love for Romy. From that day on, we never parted again. As Leah uttered her last sentences, AZ discreetly wiped the corners of her eyes. Producer Bob clapped his palms loudly and said, "Bravo, maestro, bravo." That's what I mean, a ratings boost. We are already being congratulated. We are back to the highest rating in our history in an hour and a half, and have grown it another hour and a half right now. Izzy and Bob continued to admire their successes among themselves, and Leah felt very tired from such an emotional load. They took pictures together to say goodbye, and everyone went home. Leah, by that time, had already got used to being often recognized on the street. Architect designer though it is not show business, it is surprising that she managed to become famous in this field. If before they knew her as a girl who mysteriously made her way up the career ladder, now people treat her completely differently. But until she realized it herself, a few days after that broadcast, Izzy called, "Leah, good afternoon. We need to meet with you if you have time in the next few days." "What? Your viewers are asking for a continuation of the story?" "But I have nothing more to tell. I've already told everything," said Leah and laughed. "The thing is that an important person wants to meet with you. He has a proposal for you. I would like to be present at this historical event if you allow me," Leah said AZ in riddles. "I wonder what it is to assign historical significance. AZ, I beg you, tell it like it is so that I can solve this historical issue as soon as possible," said Leah. "This man is a producer in a big movie company. He heard your story and is very touched. He wants to meet you to get your consent to make a movie about your biography," said AZ. Leah Collin didn't try to deny it any further. Since a really fabulous path has been traveled, why not share it with the masses? Maybe someone now feels the same way as a little girl locked in a damp dungeon. Leah, in her example, was able to prove that if you accept from life all the trials that fall to the share of a person, the fate goes running towards such a person with its unexpectedly steep turns for the better. Thank you for watching this video to the end. Subscribe to the channel. Like it, write comments if you like the story, and see you on the channel.